Thanks so much, Megan. Welcome everyone this afternoon. My name's Rebecca Rogers. I'd like to do a big thank you to all of our sponsors and an extra big thank you to Beck, Lorian, and especially Megan, who's behind the scenes producing this for me and making sure that my mute doesn't keep going on and off. For everything they've done this month. It's been a mammoth effort and they should be super proud of all of the work that they've done. So getting the time and budget for research is hard enough at the best of times without the challenge of not being in the same place as your staff. It's not just at the moment. This has been a reality for some organisations for a long time. My first lot of official remote research was back in 2011 for Coca-Cola Amatil. With staff in Australia and New Zealand, we had limited travel budget. We were doing research, strategy and design for their HR department. Back then, it wasn't as common as today, and we didn't have as many tools available to us. And more of us today are finding that we're conducting research in this way for a variety of reasons. My name's Rebecca Rogers. I'm super passionate about digital employee experience and design, and hopefully that will come through in some of my stories today. At step 2, we live and breathe digital employee experience, digital workplaces and intranets, and I've been in this space for over 20 years. So if you're anything like me, you've seen a lot of this lately. And Megan and I were discussing before you got on board what people's backgrounds looked like and how interesting it is when you're doing research and looking at people in different situations in their offices or their homes. And you've probably even seen a bunch of this. Yesterday, I was doing some research with an organisation, and I swear one of the ladies that I was speaking to was sitting in her daughter's cupboard. But whatever works, right? Regardless of the current situation, what happens if your staff reside here or work in a different location to you? When you're researching, regardless of the time, it's rare that you're able to be in the same place as all of the people you're researching with, especially in the case of being in their working environment. There are many reasons why we conduct research. You could be working on a new digital workplace design, a strategy, creating a business case, or trying to uncover issues and problems within the current state of work. In the chat window, why are you conducting research at the moment? Or why are you interested? Why did you sign in today? There's obvious reasons when to use remote research. The current global situation aside, remote research has always been important and needed. It's not always practical to visit all the offices and locations of your business. However, it's still important to address the needs of those staff in different cities, states, or countries. Or it could be that someone is close by, but you just can't get to their workplace. Working with global organisations like UNICEF, QBE, Coca-Cola Amatil, and others, we've needed to conduct remote research either completely or as an addition to travel and face-to-face interactions. There are many different research methods, and I'll touch on just a few today, given that the time that we have. Depending on what you're trying to achieve and who you're working with, it might require you to be a bit creative, think outside the box, use different techniques, or perhaps an adaptation of an existing technique to gather the information and get the input that you require. So I'm going to jump into the first research method, which is one that probably most of you are familiar with: interviews via video or phone. Now, these can be conducted in very much the same way as a face-to-face interview. If you haven't met the interviewee previously, it's super important to first help them understand what you're trying to achieve and the process. You don't have that existing relationship that you can have when you're face-to-face with someone. Set your expectations in the invitation. As an example, some recent research and testing that I've been doing, in the calendar invite that I sent out, I said, thanks so much for your offer to help us test our new design. There's no need to prepare at all for this interview or the meeting. Just join me in Teams, make sure that you have your voice and your video working, and I'll walk you through a few activities to help refine the design. Now, there was only one person that didn't turn their video on out of 45, and I actually think that's pretty awesome numbers. And I think part of that was because we set the expectations right at the beginning of what we wanted. Now, surveys have their place, but for me, they're best when assessing opinions rather than needs. How many times do you feel you've been surveyed or interviewed and had no idea where the results went or the impact or outcome of the research? It should always be complemented by other techniques and can be of greatest use to demonstrate current problems if they aren't already obvious. As the name suggests, this is a technique where a diary is provided to participants with guidance on the information that you require. These are most successful when you ask for specific pieces of information. For an example, list each time you visit your intranet this week, what you were looking for, if you found it. It might be the same for teams. When were you there? Who's part of the team? What tasks were you completing? Were you able to complete the tasks that you were trying to complete? Or did you find the information that you needed? What are the top questions that you're getting asked? Now, when I worked back with Coca-Cola Amatil, we actually did a diary study both in the physical form and the digital form and gave people a choice what they preferred. Now, workshops, it should be clear here that these are very different from focus groups. They must be heavily facilitated to ensure that a small number of individuals don't dominate the group. They're best when staff are at the same level to encourage open discussions. A parking lot for those discussions that you know will take a long time but don't need to be had now is super important. In a normal workshop, I'd have that stuck up on the wall, but you can have that as a whiteboard or a separate document. It's a great idea not to have more people than what you can see on your screen at any one time to help facilitate the workshop. So I'm going to take a pause now, and I'm going to ask you, based on why you're actually doing the research, which of the techniques that I showed you would work best for your organisation? And I had a couple of people say they were researching to understand experience for staff, getting used to the new norm, looking for ways to keep remote employees connected and engaged. Okay, so Pauline's mentioned surveys because there's a lot of people. One other thing I'd always suggest with surveys is that you make sure you do some other types of research as well. So maybe you could have a survey, some face-to-face interviews, a couple of workshops, because you'll get different input from the different sessions. Okay, you can keep adding to the chat and I'll move on in the presentation. Now I'm going to talk through two approaches to the tools that I use and how I actually conduct some of these types of sessions. You'll find your own way. There's lots of tools out there. One thing I'd suggest is pick the ones that are right for you and your situation. The last thing you want to do is put a barrier in place to getting the information and the input that you need. As we mentioned earlier, it's super important that the person that you're conducting the research with feels comfortable with you, trusts you, and there's no barriers to it working. Sometimes you might have all the best intentions to be creative, but at the last minute, you have to resort to what's available. When conducting interviews with a global immigration law firm across the globe, they were familiar with online video tools. I had to use their tools, which was fine, but at the last minute, their system went down. My backup was using a web version of Teams where they didn't have to download anything and they could just jump in and get started. When internet connections were a problem, we resorted to mobile or, in some cases, landline phone. It's always good to have a plan B. So the first one I'm going to talk through with you is the diary study that I mentioned before. When I can be face-to-face and conduct research, I love workplace observation. Being able to follow someone around for a couple of hours in their environment gives such rich insights. But how do we actually do that now? Remotely, it's a little harder, or maybe just a little different. You can make it work though. You could ask people to do a video tour of their workplace. Or, as I'm going to walk you through, how I do more in-depth research with an organisation in the form of a digital diary study. So one example, you can create a new team for your research. Now, for each of these research participants, I suggest that you create a private channel. That then means that any information that they share is confidential. This is super important for most employees. If they're going to be honest and upfront, they want to know that nothing's going to be linked back to their name. So it's really important to keep that and be able to then just summarize the results and the recommendations back as you go without actually betraying that trust. It's super important to explain, obviously, what you want them to do. What's great about using an example like I have here is you have your photo. It's important for them to see you, not just be that blank face. Build trust. By sharing a little bit about you, you're asking them to share a lot about them. Photos are a super rich way of getting information. As you can see here, I posted a photo of my workspace because I was actually asking the research participant to post a photo of theirs. A colleague of mine, James, tells a story of going into a call centre in a government agency and seeing a piece of paper stuck to every cubicle wall titled "Key Things You Won't Find on the Intranet." Now, this had been created by the call centre manager, but nobody in the intranet team knew it existed. If he hadn't have actually seen that, it was a super important piece of the research. Now, that's a little bit harder to get when everybody's working in remote environments, but ask people to take a photo. What have you got stuck on your wall? What's on your notebook? Getting that information from them is super important. Post daily questions. Some of you are probably at this point asking, wouldn't you just use a form to make it easier to capture and collate this information? You could, but then you wouldn't be able to capture that two-way communication, questions, and asking people for additional information. You can see in this example, I've asked them to write down the questions that they were asked today, but I also provided an example of questions that I'd been asked. Again, helping build that trust, but also giving them an example of how I'd like things to be presented. Right at the beginning, I mentioned creating separate channels for each of your interviewees. What's great is you can actually share to multiple channels. So you create one question, share it across all of your research participants. And it's really easy to follow up with any additional questions that you might have. Getting that two-way conversation and thread as you go through. I also tend to do a physical face-to-face check-in, especially seeing a lot of these diary studies might go on for a few days, a week, or even up to 2 weeks or a month, depending on the types of information that you're trying to gather from the organisation. So it's really good to just do a hi, how's it all going as you're going through. So the second one that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is workshops. We're doing lots of these. We do lots of workshops face-to-face, and we've also always done a number of workshops online. So these can be used for different things. Workshops could be used for gathering information. They could be used for testing. And in this case, the example that I'm showing you here, I've used Mural to facilitate design activities. So with this particular client, what I was doing was explaining that there's 7 different roles of an intranet homepage. And we talked through the different roles. And then I asked them to help me understand what we needed on the homepage. So this was a co-design session. Once we went through and posted the sticky notes in each of the 7 purposes, we then were able to transfer those into more of a design or a zoning activity. Where would these be presented on the page? How might it look? And they were able to interact with Mural as we went. We then created a prototype for testing. Now, this is purposefully blurry if anyone's thinking that they can't see it. So we were quite easily able to do online testing with the prototype to help understand whether we had the right elements in the homepage, whether it made sense, whether there was anything missing for employees, and whether the functionality that we had built worked in the way that they expected it to work. If you're using Mural, it can also be anonymous. So if there is a need in your workshop environment for people to not identify who they are, they can actually do that. Now, there are lots of different facilitation and workshop tools out there, and more are popping up at the moment. I've used a lot of them. Miro is another one. There's obviously the whiteboard in Teams. What I particularly like about Mural is it's almost like a big wall. I love having lots and lots of space to workshop. And you can set out your Mural up front and have lots of different activities that you can just zoom in on with your research participants as you go. There's also very little barrier to use. I haven't found any research participant yet that has struggled with adding a sticky note or joining into the Mural and being able to participate, which, as we mentioned earlier, is super important. So out of that, which tools are you keen to try? Have you tried any so far that I've mentioned? If you want to add those into the chat. And while you're doing that, anyone who'd like to enter this week's competition, feel free to scan the code now. And let's see how many of you can multitask. Scan the code and add into the chat. What are the tools that you'd be keen to try? Okay, thanks, Sean. Murals. Aslan mentioned Miro. I've also used Miro as well. The other thing I like about, I'm not sure if Miro can do this, but the other thing I liked about Mural is the voting. You can actually vote on anything on the Mural, which is also good. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really important for you to play with the tools before you actually use them with your participants. Make sure that you're comfortable in using them, and just find the one that works best for you and what you're trying to achieve. Okay, hopefully everyone got the competition code by now. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into what are the types of questions that you might want to ask when you're doing research. Obviously, it really does depend on what you're trying to achieve. But I'm going to run through a couple of different situations for you, and hopefully that will give you a bit of an idea of the types of questions you might want to ask. One of the questions you don't ask is, don't ask staff what they want or what they think of a design, because you're going to get, I don't like blue, or search doesn't work, or I can't find what I need. Instead, explore how staff work. What's involved in their day-to-day, the information that they need, what's their environment like, where do they get their information from, and what are the most frustrating tasks that they have to complete? Avoiding opinions and understanding the real workings of the organisation and the person that you're speaking to. You probably already know going in, if you're doing some research around your current digital workplace or intranet, that search doesn't work, as an example, or people can't find what they need. But it's the why that's really important. It isn't always as it seems. Another government agency, different one to what I mentioned earlier, when I was doing research with them, they said to me, the intranet team said, we've just implemented a new search engine and it's great. It's awesome. It's fixed all our problems. But on day one of interviews, a consistent theme was search didn't work. As you can imagine, I was a little bit puzzled by that. But when I started digging deeper into the why, it actually turned out that staff a long time ago had lost trust in search. It just didn't work. An email had been sent out when the new search engine got put in, but many people had missed it, that it was new and improved. So what that particular team thought was fixed actually was still a problem, or a perceived one. So this is a sample of some questions. Again, depending on who you're talking to or what you're doing, these will change. When speaking to senior stakeholders, consider questions on strategy, culture, communication. When speaking to an intranet team, you might consider questions on content, communication, governance, technology, collaboration, and social. And when speaking to staff and users, consider questions around content, communication, activity, design, structure, collaboration, and social. Now, obviously, those were very much focused on understanding the information and the environment that a person works in. Another example is when you're doing usability testing. So at a Department of Education, we had very little time to understand real users. We've been brought in to help improve the usability of an existing system. Time and access to staff was super limited. We were given 2 days, 2 schools, and a mix of existing and new users, and that's all the time that we had. But within that time, we were able to find out a lot of information. It's a different type of questioning, taking that scenario-based testing approach. In a short space of time, we were able to identify that new users weren't familiar with some of the terminology that was used in the system of board and card. Most people had bookmarked the page as they actually couldn't easily find it from their school portal or from the intranet. Those that had been to training understood the purpose, but were still unsure whether they were able to actually create in the system or not. And many were frustrated by the technology. Again, most weren't sure what different terms meant. And those that had actually experienced being able to use the system were relatively happy, but they actually didn't know that half of the functionality existed. We also identified a number of navigation and usability issues throughout the observation, and we applied those through to the design phase. Whenever you're doing research, it's super important to capture quotes. These are useful for anyone who thinks that the system's working really well at the moment, but it's also It's also good to get that real language from your end users. So out of the questions that I had earlier, do you have a favorite? Or perhaps you've got a favorite question of your own. I'll flip back to the questions. If you'd like to type into the chat window, if you have a favorite out of the questions there, obviously we'd ask a lot more than this. This is just a selection. And again, depending what you're trying to achieve. My personal favorite is, what's the most frustrating task that you have to complete? Something you think there's got to be an easier way of doing this. It's amazing how much information comes out of the woodwork when you ask that question. Thanks, John. The explain what you do that can take you down lots of different rabbit holes, which is a really good one. It does give you that overarching view at the beginning too, because sometimes you don't actually, all you're given is a title of someone that you're actually speaking to, and you don't really know what that means. Okay. Do what you can. Remember, you don't have all the answers. Even getting input from a few users can make a difference. Sometimes you need to be a bit creative, thinking outside the box. If you can't get to your users, maybe there's a different way. No time, they don't have time, offer them treats. At the moment, we're doing testing and offering a $5 coffee card that we're digitally sending to participants, and they're able to use those at their local coffee shop, which is also supporting the local community. Staff are researched out, do what you can. Even if you're only able to have a couple of people involved, it's super important. No time, that's a really common one that we hear. Think what we did in just 2 days with the teachers. Think like a toddler. Ask why, and but why, and but why. And keep asking why until you understand. Be inquisitive. Look around their workspaces. What's on their desk stuck to their wall? What maybe do they have hidden in a OneNote? We are in the technology age, but there are lots of different techniques to use. Don't discount the old school methods. Especially at the moment, people are spending more and more time than ever on screens. We're hearing lots of people saying, I'm getting too much time on a screen during a day, either via video or actually doing my work. They're craving the tactile. Think about handwriting, post-it notes, colored pens, and diaries. If you've got the time and the ability to, send them a little design kit. Be creative, especially if you're doing a co-design session or trying to gather input. Feel free to take the tactile. And don't forget to pack in a couple of lollies to say thank you as well. They always help. They can then either send you back the artifacts or take a picture of what they've created. Always remember, do what you can. Some is better than none. Even if you can get 5 people's input, it's better than just what you have in front of you. You don't have all the answers. Getting that input can really make a difference. And reap the rewards of good research, of a usable design, an improved business case, a strategy that works, or the senior exec saying yes to your project. So thank you all very much this afternoon for jumping in and participating. We do have, I've left some time for questions or comments. You can either jump in the chat window or if you wanted to unmute yourself, you can ask me questions. I'm also going to do a prize draw of our own this afternoon for our Internet and Digital Workplace Awards bundle. So for anyone who asks a great question or whatever else I feel like this afternoon. So thank you all very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties in the beginning, but we've always got to be prepared for those at the moment. So I'd like to open up for questions if there's any. Oscar, nice to see you on here. When is not research? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Okay, yes, too many people do think that research solves everything. When do you not research? I think I bundle research in with testing as well. So sometimes I won't necessarily get, it won't necessarily in a design situation, won't necessarily be important to gather requirements as such and research in that way, but it will be important for me to test a design. So I kind of treat those two things differently. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. Okay, last call for questions. We finished a couple of minutes early.